Welcome to the VO2 Lounge podcast, the podcast where we talk about the science behind athletic performance and everyday life. If you are new, then welcome, sit back, relax and enjoy the show. If you are a returning listener and haven't already done so, remember to follow, rate and share the show with your friends, or even join the VO2 Lounge Discord server. Links down below. Now this is the first episode in a new series I'm calling The Diary of a Failed Athlete. I'm going to go through my life and all its lessons regarding sport and athletic performance. In no particular order, may I add. So for example, I started off initially, like many people, playing many sports, then transitioned to rugby and then transitioned to cycling. Now I may just pick and choose where and when I deliver different episodes, but just enjoy it as it comes. This episode is going to be on why I stopped using training platforms such as Zwift, Trainer Road and Wahoo system and platforms the same as them. You don't have to look very far to find tales of people seeing massive improvements from Trainer Road and Zwift before being stuck at a plateau, being overtrained or feeling a lack of motivation to continue with their training plan. So let's explore why this is happening and why it happened to me. So let's start with some background and set the scene for this podcast episode. In 2020, we had the global pandemic, as everyone I'm sure is aware. Before this point, I played a lot of rugby. I mean, a considerable amount of rugby. I trained on the pitch between 2 and 4 times a week, played between 1 and 2 matches per week, and was in the gym between 1 and 3 times a week. Obviously, the maximum of these wasn't all at the same time. They would ebb and flow. Lower training weeks, more gym time. Higher training weeks, less gym time. More matches on a weekend, less gym time, less training, so on and so forth. I had some history of mountain biking, but no hardcore endurance really. We'd more ride about our local area, then go to mountain bike parks. To be honest, I even struggled going up any sort of reasonable climb. So endurance wasn't really my thing. That is until mid-2019 when I started cycling to work. The bug caught me, but rugby got in the way of things really taking off. The most riding I would do would be on off weeks and around Christmas kind of time. But with the pandemic, this gave me an excuse to up my volume, continue to ride more and more and more, and really I caught the bug so much that I never went back to playing rugby. Now, during the training process, I decided to take things a bit more seriously, and rather than just riding around with my friends, I decided to sign up to a Gran Fondo. The Gran Fondo in question is the Dragon Ride, a 230, approximately, depends on the year, kilometre ride with 3,500 metres of elevation. And this is in Wales as well, so extremely grippy tarmac and can be raining, can be windy. It's not the easiest place to do 230 kilometres. Now this is where Zwift and Trainer Road come in, and this is also where my problems started to occur. Before going too much further, I'd like to say at this point that Trainer Road and Zwift to some extent have moved things along a reasonable amount since I used them with any anger. Trainer Road have introduced polarized plans, albeit looking like a little bit of an afterthought, and have incorporated their AI-driven adaptive training that should address some of the burnout issues present from really driven by the ramp test. But aside from this, it's not all bad. Zwift is more than its training plans and has built an amazing online community for people to interact with, and allows you to build your own workouts. So that's always an option really. Zwift is it's more than the plans really. You can't critique the whole platform on simply its plans, but the purpose of this episode, that's what I'm looking at. And Trainer Road is a great data analysis platform with the benefit of the plan builder and workout catalogue to use as a guide. I think it's definitely a really useful tool, along with the more historic versions of the podcast. The latest stuff is a bit different, I would say, but 2020, 2019 area, there's some really good content that almost if you were listening to that in conjunction with a little bit of use of the program, you can get a long way into building your own plans. But the nature of the app leads to some confusion, which we'll cover as I go on. Now, to understand where I started to see the problem and what the problems could be with these training plans, I think you need to understand how you'd go about making a plan in the first place. And reverse engineering things is probably the best way to go about it. You will notice that I'm mainly referring to Trainer Road during the podcast. And that is to some extent a bit of a compliment towards them. Zwift is so far to some extent off the mark in relation to being an out and out training platform that the issues can be summarized pretty quickly in the lack of goal targeting and event centric plans and a longer term plan. It relies on the user to kind of plot it themselves. To my understanding is they don't have the calendar functionality, and really they are something that is tagged along, useful for the winter as something to engage you with. But even in that sense, the plans are pretty sporadic in the number of zones that are in workouts and how it all is a mishmash of things. So that's why predominantly I'm going to be talking about Trainer Road, because there's more right there than there is wrong to some extent. So building a plan can really be summarized in 3 steps. Goal events, what are the demands of the goal events, and how much time do you have to train, and over how many days are you available to train. So the goal event is important because that is your mark in the sand, or marks possibly in the sand, of when you need to have X amount of fitness or peak fitness or whatever it is, or whether it's a goal month or however it works. These are going to allow you to effectively backcast from there as to when your training needs to actually start being deliberate, and when you really need to start focusing on things, and when you can just be in your off season really. And moving on to then the demands of that goal event. Now you know where they sit. The demands allow you to, in reality, they only affect the the specificity kind of phase. They only affect the aerobic development to some extent, because those final few weeks are where you're catering your fitness physiology towards that event. So if you're doing a TT, you're not really worrying about 1 minute efforts. You're more concerned about hour, half hour, 20 minutes, whatever it is, like a sustained effort, maybe some over-unders to cope with changes in gradient. But you're not really concerned about big surges with little recovery. And then how much time you have to train is obviously critical, really. It's if you, for example, went onto a training app and you've got 8 hours, but there's no 8-hour option really, as such as it's going to say low volume, for example, or mid volume, but really you could just push a bit more. It becomes harder to do so. Now, the number of days and how much time you have is important to consider, because the more days you have, the easier the higher volume becomes. 7 days, an hour a week, 7 hours a week, compared to 3 days a week, you're going to be doing more volume on those days. But in general, this is a key thing to etch out, and also to etch it out depending where you are in the year. So for example, you may find that in your base season, you can actually train 6 days a week, and then it's only in the summer, in the better months of the year, Northern Hemisphere specific, that your time almost decreases, which is all right, because it will kind of coincide with overall hours reducing and intensity increasing. So then you may be like, oh, that's all perfectly fine. Or it may be the other way around, and it just affects how you cater that training plan. And with that kind of brief overview of them, let's go into a bit more. Now, the 3 kind of sub-pillars, I suppose you could say, are duration, volume, and frequency and intensity distribution. That's kind of now you've gone past the very raw basics of what's the event, what are the demands, and how much time can I train. Now you've got that, you need to figure out these next 3 steps. Now from this, we can split training into a base phase or a general endurance phase, an aerobic development phase, and a race specific phase. Now these last between 10 and 14 weeks, 3 and 4 weeks, and 2 to 4 weeks respectively, giving you something in the region of a 20-week plan in total when you look at these kind of numbers. Now this is if you got a season for between March and September, that's 7 months, which is 30 weeks. Add 4 weeks before the beginning of the season, say, and then that brings you to 34. And if you start in Jan, then that's 38 weeks approximately. So a pretty long season. These aren't short seasons. It obviously depends on kind of sport you're doing. So you really don't want to already overextend this any more than you need to. Now this is where you encounter kind of the first issue, specifically in a Trainer Road sense. If you didn't know any better and picked up a training app right now, right this moment, you went, I'm taking next season seriously, because, I don't know, maybe I got sick or whatever, or I'm new to the sport and I really want to take this seriously, you'd be thrown straight into structured training from now. Now this is a common for the time of year where people who didn't feel like they got enough for their season do so. You decide to dedicate yourself to this. Now you're likely to feel great for a month or 2 or maybe 3, but come the time when you should actually be ramping up training, you're already going to be a bit fed up and still 4 or 5 months out from your goal event. It's really hard, and this is what I found, starting in approximately like the October time, doing these intervals, specifically a lot of sweet spot work, doing the low volume plan 3 days a week. Every day was pretty much intensity other than the rest weeks where you do zone 2. And you're like, yeah, FTP's going up, doing ramp tests, feeling great. But then you get to like December and you go, Jesus, my event isn't until June, and I'm already like, feel like I've peaked almost. I've I've cashed all my chips. I feel like I've done a lot of work already. The simple solution to this would be for the app to say, take it easy and noodle about for a bit. But this is where the conflict of interest starts to come between optimal results and getting people to buy the app. And they feel like they're getting their money's worth from the app. I'm almost wondering if it would be more successful or less successful to have a larger, longer term follow base if they said, hey, don't start training until 20 weeks or 30 weeks out and just Zwift about for a bit. Just noodle around. Don't take it too seriously. And whether people would just carry over the subscription for the 3 months, 4 months in between, purely because they're too lazy to stop it. But obviously, if you are new, pay for a plan, you're like, I don't know, 10 months away, 8, 9 months away, you pay for this plan and it just says, yeah, you just free ride for 4 months. We won't give you anything other than maybe occasionally say, oh, just go have like a little group ride today or whatever and smash about for a bit. You'd kind of be like, hey, this is nonsense. But in reality, probably if you're going with a coach, there's a different level of, you may be doing other specific stuff over that off season to benefit you later. Maybe it's going to the gym, maybe it's doing other sports just to keep you like interested, and they'll moderate things and start formulating a plan for you for the next year. But obviously that's a lot more expensive. Now, with the duration of the training plans, them clearly kind of being too long because they're an all year round thing with intensity pretty much all the time, it's important to look at then the volume. When you have started training, and you should actually be training, how much volume do you do? Well, from professionals we can see the volume is key, and most of us will never reach our genetic ceiling due to it really. Results from studies have shown that, this is going to be running specific because that's what I found, but they've shown that in half marathon runners, a higher training volume, longest endurance run, and higher training pace are related to a faster finish time, while a higher training volume and longest endurance run are also related to less decline during a race. In marathon runners, a lower weekly training volume, shorter longest endurance run, and slower training pace are associated with a slower finish time, while a higher weekly training volume and faster training pace were related to faster finish times, which is probably obvious. I mean, you can kind of just ignore the training pace as such, because that's kind of then obvious to some extent. But effectively, the volume is necessary for, one, probably cultivating the training pace, the lack of a decline over the course of a race, which even if you're cycling and doing a criterium that's only an hour, that is where the volume comes into. It's less important because the race is shorter. So to get to the elite level, you probably don't have to do as many hours a week in comparison to someone trying to get to the elite level road racing, but still all important. Now, this isn't cycling specific, of course, but the extracts have taken, but it is still incredibly relevant. Now, this is where what I see as like an over focus on raw TSS and not raw hours and training distribution hinder progress, and a lack of true aerobic stimulation, allowing for the adaptations necessary for later in your training plan. Coming into the new plans, really, obviously to keep people stimulated and to make it look complex and allow for gains early on. Sweet spot's great. It feels hard, but not too hard. It's very interactive because there's a change of pace somewhat frequently. It's not just a flat zone 2 ride. You're going to see your FTP increase, but doing it 2 or 3 times a week so far out from any event is probably isn't advisable, and it's what's going to really burn you out unless you are incredibly driven, really. And yeah, it is what it is. But what is lacking, especially if you haven't already got it, is that these zone 2 adaptations that are crucial to allow you to perform at sweet spot, perform at thresholds, perform at a VO2 interval, and so on and so forth. So the key here is the presence of adequate zone 2 work, and zone 2 training is also referred to as base aerobic training. All elite athletes spend months doing base training, which isn't necessarily, I suppose months means just more than 2, but their base season could be a lot longer / a lot more intense than an amateur's, and you can really leave it fairly late to some extent. At least 75 to 8% of their training is also in this zone 1 to zone 2 area, rather than a huge distribution at high intensity. Now, if you're only able to do 3 hours a week, right, it may be that you don't achieve the 80 to 75%, because it's actually like 33%, because you spend an hour out twice a week doing zone 2, and then you spend an hour basically sat at sweet spot during your like base buildy kind of season. So the 80-75, so 80-20 split isn't necessarily a hard and fast rule. It's more that clearly once you're doing 20 to 30 hours a week, you have to stick to an 80-20 kind of split, otherwise you'll burn out. However, as you come down in volume, this is not to say you still stick to 80-20. If you've only got 3 hours to train, you're not going to do like 20 minutes a week or 10 minutes a week at threshold or sweet spot. You're just going to have to do more. But it's important that you've still got a predominant number of your days is spent at a zone 2 level. Now, during zone 2 training, you will increase your number of mitochondria, mitochondrial efficiency, and increase your metabolic flexibility. Now, metabolic flexibility refers to the ability for your mitochondria to utilize fat and glucose as an energy source, aka switching between different substrates with ease is the kind of key thing here. At lower heart rates, your main source of fuel should be fat, not glucose. Poorly functioning mitochondria, which are likely to be found in 75% approximately of people, will result in metabolic inflexibility, or the inability to use fat versus glucose. And this is where you get people who your state, should I say, how you feel fluctuates greatly, and the glucose spikes can be quite high and then big troughs, simply because you just over rely on it, tapping into it a lot. And doing a lot, it's not that doing purely sweet spot or intensity 2 times, 3 times a week when you're only training 3 times a week is going to turn you into that sedentary-esque person, because you're already going to be improving all these factors, but nowhere near as much, and you're going to reach a plateau in the season really early. Like say you started in January, or in this case like October in my case, and what I saw was I hit like a 330 watt FTP, 340 almost, on a ramp test. But then for the rest of the year, I never went past that, because I kept on yo-yoing in and out of Trainer Road plans, basically getting burnt out, recover, burn out, recover, burn out, recover, and just maybe drop to 300 watts, come back up to 330, drop down to 300, and just yo-yo, but never break through that ceiling. And that's where people could be. Now you can kind of see that in looking at the general base volume. The high volume plan's only 9 hours a week, which is not high volume. My off season, where I go, one, I no longer ride on the weekends for social reasons, for life reasons. Just I cut off the weekends, and I just commute to work Monday to Friday on the bike, assuming there's no rain or it's not absolutely treacherous or whatever. For the most part, I would try to ride those 5 days, which brings me to 6 to 7 hours a week, which I would consider I wouldn't even say it's like I say a moderate amount of volume would be, we're talking 10 to 15 kind of area, 15 to 20, that is where you start saying 20 hours a week, high volume definitely. But 8 to 9 hours at the peak is really not. The low volume is true as such, it's 3 to 4 hours, 5 to 6 hours, and then traditional base, that's where you see the peak of their plans at 10 to 11, and then the polarized training, which arguably you'd use to be able to push up your volume because you can't get that volume from high intensity, it's still only 7 to 8 hours a week. So this is where the general trend is carried through these phases of training volume on Trainer Road, with volume decreasing as it should as you progress through from base, build and specialty, but overall hours just constantly remaining fairly low. Really, this highlights the fact that indoor training is two things, subjectively in my opinion quite boring and uncomfortable. So getting long rides in on the trainer, especially at zone 2 where there's a lot of pressure through the contact points other than the feet, so the posterior and the hands, it's going to make it really uncomfortable to do long rides, and they're simply not going to happen. So where do you get it from? Intensity. Now, this is the argument I see coming up where people say 1 hour on the trainer is like 1.5 hours outdoors, so a 10-hour plan is actually 15 hours outdoors. But if you're, and that's driven by the fact that there's no stopping and constant pedaling. But if your outdoor rides have this, they have lots of stops, lots of coasting, then it highlights more of an issue with your discipline and route selection than anything else. So for example, obviously when I'm doing the zone 2 rides, you plan something where you can stop as little as possible. If you're going downhill, as long as it's not a really steep gradient, you just carry on, stay on the pedals and so on and so forth. And then sometimes people complain about getting intervals, you get interrupted. Well, what I do is I've got various across where I live, there are various points where there is maybe a 5 to 10, if I'm lucky, more like a 5-kilometer loop, which are all left-hand turns. In the UK, you ride on the left-hand side or drive on the left-hand side, which means that I only have to be concerned with one direction of traffic, the traffic that I'm bleeding in with. So I can clearly spot the car, slow down, pedal a little slower, and then come back in and not need to stop and interrupt the interval. Yes, maybe say I'm at 300 watts, it has to drop to like 260 for 3-4 seconds, but then I can get back into things really quickly. And often if you do it on a weekend morning or a morning on a weekday when it's quite quiet still, you can get these interrupted sessions and not be bored out of your mind, personally. But this is just bringing it back, is where the TSS overall, TSS is great for understanding, okay, why do I feel incredibly tired this week? Look, I only did 10 hours and last week I did 15. But then if you look at the TSS and you go, whoa, okay, I did race this week and did do intensity, or I raced twice this week. My TSS is like 400 versus that 15-hour week that was 350. These are just arbitrary numbers. I don't think they correlate very well, but it's a useful tip for that. But it is so much easier to progressively overload the system, especially if you're starting at the beginning of the year with volume, because you start off and you go, right, my plan is for the base phase, I'm going to ride 7 days a week. I'm going to ride every week, every day of the week. But I'm only riding 3 days a week at the moment because it was the off season. Well, the first 3 weeks can literally just be, okay, I'm going to ramp up to 7 days a week. Progressive overload. You hit 7 days a week. Okay, well, I'm going to now bring in my sweet spot intensity ride. So you do that. And then now you've got 7 days a week and you're at your full hour at sweet spot, or half an hour, or 2 20-minute blocks, or whatever it is. Just say you're going to do just 1 hour total volume. And then from there, you can come back, you can bring in just look at other days, go, I can squeeze in an hour here, hour there, rather than just trying to squeeze in intervals everywhere and getting to the point where you ride 3 days a week, but every time you ride the bike, it's flat out intervals and you're burning out because you don't want to ride the bike, because every time you get on it, it's intensity. So that, I think, is the biggest glaring issue with that methodology of training. Now, I've almost gone ahead of myself here. I was going to talk about frequency and intensity distribution, but I've effectively just spoken about the fact that the whole 80-20 split, the fact that if you're training less, you can't necessarily follow this, but these training plans often take it to an extreme of 3 days of intensity. And one thing I will add is that if you're looking at your whole week's training and you've got 3 days a week, and on each day you're doing intervals, those rest periods aren't really zone 2 or zone 1 adaptation. Like, they are not causing that, because once you tip into that glycolytic process, for your body to come back to using fat oxidation rather than glucose oxidation to fuel the activity, isn't going to happen in a minute or 2 minutes or 3. So if you're trying to up the volume, but you can't add more days, so you're adding zone 2 into it, don't increase the rest periods, don't add it to the end of the ride, add it at the beginning. Start at the beginning, long warm up, or just a taper into your zone 2, ride at zone 2 for an hour, then do your intervals to maximize and increase the quality of that zone 2 work. So really, if you're doing 3 days a week and there's a high intensity only, there's basically no zone 2 in your activity other than that warm up, really. So that's what really results in because effectively it's like you're jumping straight to the like your specialty, your race specific adaptations. You're just going sharpening the spear, right, straight away. You hit the plateau like you naturally will in a season. At some point you are going to hit your plateau, but you're hitting it really early, and then you're getting burnt out because you're not seeing any results. And that's simply how it is. what I think is worth discussing is the method of FTP testings and the abundance of workouts. The abundance of workouts real quick. I think that's why it can be quite daunting getting into a training plan or making your own or doing things yourself, because you, on any of these, Wahoo System, Trainer Road and Zwift, and any of the others that exist, to keep people engaged and to add a level of technicality to things, there are 1,000,001 different workouts. And you could probably, I'd have to go through it workout by workout, but you could probably get away with 10 unique workouts, ignoring like the difference between 1 hour at zone 2, 2 hour at zone 2, 3 hour, 4 hour. Effectively, all you need is a rough zone 2 workout, which is just ride at zone 2, a sweet spot workout, which can just be progressively overloaded from 10-minute intervals to 20 to 30 to an hour for the intervals, FTP or like threshold workouts where you're doing 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes of threshold, and then VO2 stuff where you're doing 30 seconds, 40 seconds, a minute, and different variations which you can use really either leading up to your goal event or to maintain things throughout the season. You don't need these ever-changing workouts. Over-unders are another one that are useful for certain types of racing, but there isn't a need for like 400 different workouts. You don't necessarily need that. With the FTP testing, the use of a ramp test pretty much always overestimates what true 1 hour power, and therefore also makes the intervals too challenging. My personal experience, had a 300 watt FTP and it was alright. I probably just didn't do the ramp test to the best of my ability, but it ended up being an ideal number for training. Then came back to the 330, and the 330 watt intervals were so far out of my reach for anything more than like 1 week or 2 weeks before I really got burnt out, because they were really, really hard. Whereas if I had done either two things, one, a 20-minute test and really identified what my ability is to maintain a power output, or two, done a ramp test and taken like, what would 10 watts be? What would 20 watts be? It'd be almost 10%. It'd be like 7% off the ramp test value and gone with that. It's a bit like vanity lifting, trying to lift a weight too heavy with lower reps because you want to lift the bigger number rather than trying to do any form of hypertrophy work to gain muscle when you hit a plateau or poor form or so on and so forth. Training with that higher FTP or saying you got that FTP is kind of like that. So that's where I think FTP testing can be addressed. Yes, TrainerRoad specifically has got an AI-driven system now. As to how successful that is, not 100% sure. But for reference of other programs, probably just things like critical power and FTP are useful, but know that they are not the be-all and end-all of your performance and of your training intensities and training. So after shooting all these things down, I should probably mention what my personal approach is to things now as an alternative to following these training programs. So, starting with the final race of the year. After the last race of the year, I become pretty lax with riding and only do my commute to work, allowing me to peak volume, as I've said, 6 to 7 hours a week, sometimes even less if weather or what life gets in the way. And I feel no regret or obligation to pick up the volume elsewhere. Sometimes, I'll throw a weekend ride because the weather's great or whatever, but it's not essential. And then more strength training can be picked up and implemented into daily life and fix any niggles or look at the bike fit or so on and so forth. There's time to tinker, time to mess around, time to enjoy other things. And then approximately January, but based on where the A event is, I'll bring my volume back up and get to the point where I'm riding 6 to 7 days a week consistently. Then I backtrack from the key event 20 weeks out and mark that point in the calendar, which is where I will begin to bring in intensity in the form of sweet spot work. Now, base only intensity is most of the week in this period of base work. Now, and then there'll just be one interval session where I'll try accumulate a total hour of sweet spot work. That's not a hard and fast value. Depends on how I'm feeling. It may be 40 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. At the beginning of the year, it may only be 20 minutes or 2 20-minute intervals. But try hit that total volume of 1 hour at sweet spot and develop the whole aerobic system. Then I'll move on to the build phase or the aerobic development phase, which is 2 intensity days, usually one which is sweet spot and the other which is a more threshold specific, like 4 to 10 minute effort intervals. Then race specific, it's kind of in the name, whatever the goal event is, which is a little bit hard because for me personally, the goal is not necessarily an event, it's more points to do with ranking up through the categories. So to some extent, actually peaking for an event is a bit harder because you're like, I want to race like 20 races or whatever it is, or 25 or 30, however many it is. So it becomes more of a, how do I have a bigger plateau? How do I have a bigger point at peak fitness? But also which course specifically suits my physiology the best, peaking for that and tapering that fitness specificity phase to that event. And then post a race or post the race that I deem the most important, I'll just simply maintain things through keeping a moderately high volume, doing 30-30s or 40-20s or 1 minute on, 1 minute offs, like high VO2 work around races. Say I've got like 2 weeks between a race, then maybe ease things up, get a little bit of recovery in, and then go back at it like the week of the race, some high intensity stuff, and just get to the end of the season that way. Now there are other, criterions when lower. You can still follow the A, B, and C-esque races, which is still useful, but taper it towards your specific needs. So to summarize things, what have we found? Well, we found that possible reasons for the burnout seen in these training plans is 1, the over dependency on total TSS from the form of high intensity intervals, starting the season effectively too early and starting structured training too early in the year, and 3, a lack of overall volume and a lack of overall zone 2 specific volume could all be leading to the burnout and the lower natural peak in the season. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics at the VO2 Lounge at gmail.com or on the VO2 Lounge Discord server. Links all below. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it's goodbye.